Yeah, it really makes you question. And I saw this in some of the vignettes too, like what we define as marriage, because for a lot of these child-free couples, they don't necessarily need the same exact protections and they don't necessarily get benefits by actually having the piece of paper signed. On the other hand, these are people who very much see themselves as life partners.
Yeah, ignore the emotional and the love and those reasons to get married. The number one reason I see why people get married is actually healthcare benefits. If they could get healthcare benefits without getting married, they'd probably be okay. Where I also get people that been couples forever, whatever. I get groups of friends, romantic, whatever it is. And that's okay because it's their family, their lifestyle. I will tell you, though, the system breaks down. So if you want to see something interesting, so you're a medical doctor, think about it this way. What happens if somebody comes into the hospital, into your practice, and doesn't have a next of kin to make decisions for them?
Welcome to the Childfree Wealth Podcast, hosted by Bree and Dr. J, certified financial planner. Here we discuss life and finances as it relates to being child-free. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please consult your advisor before implementing any ideas heard on this podcast. Hey everyone, we are on our way to 100 episodes and we're going to be doing a special little milestone. Today we're revisiting one of the unforgettable moments with Childfree Wealth. So this episode originally aired on the Earn and Invest podcast with Doc G. If you missed it the first time or want to hear it again, go ahead and have a listen today as we feature Dr. J's conversation.
I'm Jay Zigmont and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
I have to admit that I've occasionally found myself fantasizing. Things would be so much easier if I didn't have children. This is especially true when it comes to finances. They have cost far more than expected, even when we are trying to be sensible. For instance, our love of the public and tax-supported school system was not enough to keep my daughter in an environment in which she was being relentlessly bullied. Our best and only other option, a private school, ended up costing the equivalent of a college tuition for 5 whole years. But it's not just envy, but something more sinister. I often see a downright dismissal of the child-free journey in many personal finance realms. Of course they paid off all their debt in just 4 years. They don't have kids. In many ways, it is viewed as a shortcut, an easy button, perhaps cheating. Yet the demographics are changing. My children are 2 of 9 grandchildren, all in their teens and 20s. Of the whole lot, only 1 is planning on having children, and a few of the others are vehemently opposed. Child-free wealth is a growing trend in America and will be for the foreseeable future. Today, we'll talk about it on Earn and Invest. Jay Zigmont is the founder of Childfree Wealth, a life and financial planning firm dedicated to helping child-free and permanently childless people. Dr. Jay is a certified financial planner and author of the book Portraits of Childfree Wealth. He is also the co-host of the Childfree Wealth Podcast. His PhD is in adult learning from the University of Connecticut. Jay, welcome to Earn and Invest. I read your book, Portraits of Childfree Wealth, cover to cover and found a lot of valuable insight. Yet I noticed that you do have some harsh critics. I'm going to quote here from a review. They say you are a self-gratifying man, congratulating yourself for dedicating to a life of meaningless consumerism and laziness. I would never trade my 4 kids and the joys that come with spending time with them in exchange for having more money in my bank account. It raises the question that I think a lot of people have. Is being child-free selfish?
I don't know if it's selfish or not. I'll come back to it just one second. I love these reviews. I actually had somebody that put one of those reviews before the book had come out. And it went through this whole spiel about it. And I'm like, wait a minute. You haven't read the book and you're already judging. And that is the truth. I mean, people say, well, being child-free is selfish. And I go, well, I don't know if it is or isn't. I mean, everybody gets to make their own choice. The difference is child-free folks have put a whole lot of time and thought into this concept and said, nope, it's not right for me for whatever reason. There's people, and I actually studied this for the book, and some people just didn't want to have kids. Some people it's finances, some people it's freedom, some people it's medical reasons, environment, all different reasons. People go, well, you're selfish. I'm going, wait, what's selfish about not wanting to pass on generational trauma or not wanting to put financial burdens on someone? And people go, well, but who's going to take care when you're older? And all this judgment that just comes. And I mean, I'm in I run Childfree Wealth in Mississippi. It's deep in the South and in a post-war world. The judgment is nonstop. But really, I'm going, what are you judging? I mean, we're just living our best lives. You live yours. I don't get a vote in your life. You don't get a vote in mine.
We're going to talk in a moment about specifically why people decide to be child-free, but let's talk about your personal journey. When did you make this decision, and was there a lot of pushback from family and friends?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we've been married, 14 years or so, and that's a quiz question. I guess I should get that right. But 14 years is what we're going to say.
Yeah, that sounds good. 14 years.
And when we got married, found out she's a 50-50 chance of dying if she gets pregnant. So she's got her medical issues. I'm going to be honest, it made our choice pretty simple for us. And it's interesting because people often, well, you're child-free, you hate kids or make these judgments. And I'm like, no, I just didn't want my wife to die. It's kind of where it went. And whether it's by choice or not, I don't know. I call myself child-free. People who not by choice tend to call themselves childless. But that was it. And here's an interesting one. We went to get married, and my wife was raised in the Catholic Church, and her family wanted to get married in Catholic Church. Cool. I was raised Methodist. No biggie either way. Said, go to Catholic Church, go to the priest. They say, well, you have to agree to raise your kids Catholic. We said, fine, we're not having any. We'll agree to raise them Catholic. He goes, oh, no, you have to agree to have kids and raise them Catholic. We couldn't even get married in the Catholic Church. So when you talk about judgment and all the other things, I mean, it started there and went downhill from there in many cases.
Yeah, I've heard that about the Catholic Church, I think, because they don't necessarily believe in birth control, right? So this idea of not having children is just somewhat anathema. And we see that in lots of religions. I think it's important, too, that we define exactly what you mean by child-free, because you talk about it extensively in your book, and family structures are very different nowadays than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So what exactly do you mean by child-free?
Yeah, so the way we define it is people who don't have kids and aren't planning on having kids. So if you go online, people go, hey, I'm child-free for the weekend. No. That's not our point. Like, from a financial planning standpoint, your plan changes when kids are never going to be in the picture. Now, child-free tends to be people by choice. Childless tends to be not by choice. And we let people use their own terms. But what happens is that key point is when it's not a choice. So we have people, it's not going to happen. So we have people, the term used to be called dinks, dual income, no kids. Well, there's a big difference between being a dink and what we call a dinky, dual income, no kids yet. Those are going to change it. If you're still trying to conceive, you're still not sure about having kids, follow the standard financial plan. When there's never going to be kids in the picture, that's where child-free finances shift.
And I feel like there's also a mindset piece to it. Although this was rare in your book, the book is a series of vignettes, but one person you did discuss was dating someone who had a child, and they were trying to figure out their life and what that was going to look like. But it obviously gets a little complicated, right?
Yeah, and that was an interesting story. JC's in there. She's talking about her portrait of compromise, what we called it. And we had this great discussion because she had actually started dating someone and didn't know he had kids, and then found out later he did. And the question was, is that acceptable? And by the way, I'm not judging. It's up to you. I mean, that's completely up to you. And she was like, well, I don't know. And she actually emailed me later and said, hey, I broke up with him. And I kind of felt bad because like maybe I started the questions. But it's one of those in the community, it's a big discussion. If it's somebody else who is more in kind of a polyamorous routine, will never get married, she's dating somebody who has kids, and it's okay because it's not going to be part of her financial picture. Whatever works for you is what works. I'm not here to like gatekeep and say who's child-free or who's not.
And let's get the facts out right now. Is building wealth easier if you were child-free? I mean, is it a basic fact? Can we agree on that?
The way I like to say it is being child-free does not automatically make you rich. So income disparities are still the case. So there's somebody in the book who their big goal was they had moved from being on an air mattress to being on an actual mattress. So income disparities are there. Now, living a life of child-free wealth means you have more time, money, and freedom. Doesn't necessarily mean a higher net worth. If you look at the census numbers, they found that single childless women over 55 have the highest net worth over the next group, which is fathers, but only by a couple $1,000s, and it wasn't statistically significant. And part of that may be because that's not our goal. Dying with zero is more the goal than having a giant net worth. Yes, we don't have to pay the, whatever it is, $18,000 on average per year that costs for a kid, and that's there. But there's no like fairy that comes through with a check and says, hey, you're child free, and all of a sudden you're rich.
And I would add to that, just being child-free doesn't mean that life is easy or not problematic, right? Because when we learn from your vignettes is these are people with struggles, just like people who have kids. Maybe the struggles are slightly different, but still defining a sense of purpose, deciding what you're going to do with your everyday life, and financial struggles are all very real, whether you have kids or not.
Yeah, I spend half my time talking to child-free folks about their finances, and the other time talking to financial people about child-free people. And I was at a conference recently, and somebody was out there speaking, and they said, "Well, getting divorced when you don't have kids is so much easier." And I'm like, hold on, like there is way too much judgment in that statement. You have no clue what anyone's life is like. It's different. It is not easier, not harder. It's different. And I just think people just jump to these judgments and say, well, child-free people have it easy. And that is all their stuff they're putting on to those other people. And it's amazing to me. I have so many people praying for my soul and this, that, and the other. And, I'm making the wrong choices. I'm like, okay, fine. But really what they're doing is they're reflecting themselves onto others. We often get this question, well, what if you regret it? And my argument is I'd much rather regret not having kids than have kids and regret it. Like, seriously. Because there's such things called parental regret. We
don't talk about it a lot. On the other hand, every parent I know, when you get them in vulnerable moments, will say, I love my kids, but I kind of am, feeling quite under a bit of duress, either financially or emotionally. And this idea of not having kids, not so horrible at the moment.
Well, and we get a lot of honesty from people. And the most honest statement I ever heard is, I love my kids. I hate being a parent. That's a way to put it that makes sense. And people go, well, you're going to regret being child-free. I'm like, you're putting that on us. The actual data says that people don't. Maybe I'll regret not being an astronaut too, but it's not going to change anything because I wasn't an astronaut.
Occasionally, I, as someone who has kids, has someone come and ask me, tell me about your decision to have kids or not. Someone who's contemplating having children. And I guess the best answer I can give is exactly that. I love my children, but now seeing them 16 and 19, if we had had some type of medical problem and we couldn't have had kids, I think knowing what I know now, I would be at peace with that. I can't even imagine living a life different than the one I live now. And I guess that's my coming to terms with the fact of acknowledging that kids add a whole different part to your life emotionally and financially. And it's not all good. I mean, some of it's just downright difficult and painful.
I don't judge them, and I'm just asking them, hey, not judge me. It's just, in an ideal world, your life choice will be your life choice. I think what we find, though, is that the standard life script says you go to school, you get married, you have kids, you buy the house, you retire, you pass the generation. That is so ingrained in culture and religion and life that anyone that goes against it, the technical term, you're a deviant. You've deviated from the plan. People are like, oh, you're doing the wrong thing. No, I'm doing my own thing.
Yeah, you use the term life script, and I also think about the American dream, right? And I think or the American dream script, and I think they're very similar ideas. It's not easy to go against the grain, especially I think in the older generations. As I was mentioning in my introduction, the kids actually nowadays are looking at climate change and the political upheaval, and a lot of them are voicing, I don't know if I want to bring kids into this world, but certainly in the older generations, you were really being outside the norm if you said, I don't want to have kids. So why do people make this decision? Is it as varied as the number of people, or are there some real central themes to why do people decide not to have kids?
So when you look at the number, actually, interesting enough, most people had more than one reason why they picked it. And I'm going to go over some of the top ones just for fun. So the number one reason at 38% was just never wanted children. So they knew from the young age, just didn't want to. And there's that population. 30% said finances. 27% said freedom, 15% said environmental, 13%, just shy of 14%, said they just don't like kids, which is a judgment everybody jumps at. Well, you're child-free, you don't like kids. No, there's percentage, but not really. But then it gets into really interesting things of medical issues, personal medical and health issues. They don't want to pass things down. Mental health issues where they don't want to pass down mental health concerns, pregnancy concerns, family trauma. I mean, heavy, deep stuff of why people are being child-free. And I think what I found is no two people are the same on, kind of how they got there, but they put a lot of thought and effort into it, which is different. You talk to a lot of parents, they're like, yeah, I didn't really think about it. It was just kind of what you do and just kind of happened, or it was oops, or whatever you want to call it. And child-free folks are putting thought in it, and people go, well, they're going to change their minds. There's somebody in the book, 21, who's sterilized. They're not changing their mind.
I was captivated by the vignettes, and one thing that hit me over and over again, I was going to wait to talk about this later, but it was so profound. I feel like almost everyone at some point mentioned freedom, that freedom was just so essential to this decision. But in a sense, I'm not actually sure what that means, because it's one of these big amorphous terms. Is freedom the thread that seemed to carry throughout when you were interviewing people?
It's not only when I'm interviewing people, it's when I'm working with clients. And I'll give you an example of this. Most people set up, standard financial plan. If I take any two parents' financial plans, they're actually very similar. Just the numbers change slightly, but number of kids, number of money, and when you retire, those numbers change. But child-free folks, they're all over the place. So a great example is I'm working my second book, and my editor, her and her dog live in a Airbnb for a month in a different area of the U.S. and just move. I'm like, where are you this week? Joshua Tree. Where are you next week? Vermont. It's a level of freedom that is completely different. And I got clients that will have 3 different sets of goals in a year, because who knows where they're going. Where we talk about financial independence, live early, and dialing in life and following your passions at a rate that some parents could do, but you just don't have that. The van life, the living as an expat, all these things, whatever you want to call freedom to you. In some cases, just freedom to be able to tell your boss, you know what, I don't like this job. I'm going to move cross country and go to somewhere else. My wife and I, we embraced something we call the gardener and the rose, where one's growing, one's providing support. She got a great job opportunity. It's 1,200 miles away. We packed up the dog and the cat and went. We can do that. That's that level of freedom. And it's different for each person, but it's the same theme of I can live my best life whenever I'm ready. And maybe that's selfish, back to your original question.
Yeah. And who knows? I don't even know. It's always hard to tell, what does selfish mean in the world today, right? Because, on some level, our goal is to live our best lives, right? And to do things that are purposeful to us. And so it's really hard to put that in perspective. Freedom was definitely one of the themes I saw over and over again. Another theme which honestly surprised me is this idea of regret, or more importantly, absence of regret. It sounds like this population very rarely has regrets about their decisions. I didn't see almost any regret in the vignettes. Is this also true of your coaching and counseling? Do you see people later in life saying, boy, I wish I had thought this through more, or boy, maybe I could have done it?
So we have an annual child-free convention, and pretty much every year there's a session over 80s and child-free. And, they're always asking the regret question. It's amazing. I think that question comes from outside the community, but we have to deal with it inside the community. And you're not seeing it. So somebody reviewed the book, and, they was from outside, actually from Goodreads, and they said, I was surprised by the lack of regret in the book. And I'm like, well, these people are just giving their lives. And I actually did a separate survey to go with it. And I asked the question, are you happy? Just open-ended, kind of like, are you happy with your life? 94% of people said yes. You would never see that in the general population.
Yeah, I wonder what the percentage is in the general population and how that compares. 94 sounds pretty darn high. That's a pretty good percentage.
Normally
of people.
It's less than half are happy with their life. I mean, it's I can't compare apples to apples because of different study designs, but 94% is through the roof. And the people that said no, they went on their way to put a note. Hey, it's not because I'm child free or not. It's because I have medical issues, or I'm dealing with something else, or whatever else. But huge numbers. So my take on this is being child free won't automatically make you rich, but it may make you happy. And I talk about it as Marie Kondoing your life. You do stuff that brings you joy and get rid of the stuff that doesn't. And that's a freedom that, I'd be honest, you don't have that same freedom. I mean, maybe once the kids are out of the house, you might have more of it, but.
Let's talk about some of the other themes that you saw in your interviews and that we can read about. One is this relationship between growing up poor and being child-free. You found these things consistently together. Now, of course, causation and correlation, we don't know if they ride together for other reasons or if one causes the other, but this is something you definitely saw.
Yeah, and I see it a lot in the clients. And I grew up broke, so maybe I'm reflecting myself into some of it. So you got to be aware of your own bias. But people that saw their parents struggle financially often went, I don't want to do that to my kids. And that I can follow that logic. Now, correlation, causation, we can research to death, but there's this constant theme. And I do wonder, the newer generations, the younger generations who are struggling financially, is that going to become a bigger theme of people say, well, I can't even afford housing right now. How am I going to afford a kid? Good question. I don't blame them. If you're still living in your parents' house and you're 30, like, what am I going to do? Raise my kid in the house with my parents? That's a good debate. I don't know if, like one causes the other or vice versa, but it was so common that it matches the, 30% of folks said finance was one of the reasons they chose to be child free. But the way you were raised, your reaction to your family is going to help if you pick kids or not. Another one that was interesting, little less in the book, but it was more in the survey, was the amount of people that cited, personal trauma growing up as reasons for not having kids, which, by the way, financial trauma is also, it's much of the same, but they were talking about, they don't want to pass on trauma and, generational trauma and systematic issues. And I was like, wow, that's some deep stuff. I could probably research that for my rest of my life, just that question. And I think what we're going to see is the more people struggle, the more they're going, hey, I don't want to put this onto another person. You go to the extreme. There's actually a group they call antinatalists. So antinatalists are saying, hey, nobody should ever be born. They're saying, don't bring people into the suffering. And they are by nature child free, but child free people aren't antinatalists. But there's also on the other side, the pronatalists, which people say everybody should have kids. I think in the middle, some good discussions, but the antinatalists are of the thought of, hey, you are bringing somebody in, not by their choice, into a life of suffering. And I'm not saying, I don't necessarily, follow that model myself, but I'm going, that's an interesting perspective, especially for those that are struggling financially and other things.
I want to talk about financial independence. I'm guesstimating, being part of the financial independence retire early community, we often think about, could this message go out to the world as a whole? But when you really look at it, only probably a few percentage of people are even aware of it, much less followers of financial independence or FIRE, financial independence retire early. I found like there were multiple conversations in these vignettes about financial independence. Are child-free people more aware of financial independence and the financial independence movement? I know you discuss FILE versus FIRE, and we can talk about those differences, but I felt like the theme interwove with being child-free and personal finance in general, maybe to a higher degree than I would see in the general population.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things you look at is if people who are child-free get out of debt, max out their retirement accounts, and just don't do anything silly, they're on the path to financial independence. But just kind of the nature of the beast.
It's simpler.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you don't have the outside costs, and you just do the right things for a while and you're okay. And to the point where I called a lot of the people just did, boring finance, and we're okay with it. It wasn't called financial independence. It just kind of like did the right thing. The interesting thing, and since I've done the book, I've done more research on this. What I'm finding is child-free folks don't really want to retire. There's somebody in the book who retired, late 30s, early 40s, got bored, went back, started a company, where financial independence, retire early, assumes retirement is the goal. And we can have some separate discussions on, barista FIRE and some of the other things where you're still doing some work. But from a financial standpoint, if you're still doing some work, you're not retired. There's a different math equation there. But what ends up happening is, throughout the book, people are going, hey, I'm just doing the right things. Now what? What's the point of life? And we call it the child-free midlife crisis. You get your personal, professional, financial goals, and then you're like, and what's next? And for parents, they pass those goals on to their next generation. There's a lot of other things to go with it. But the child-free folks are like, And whether you want to call that financial independence or just good finance, whatever, there are people in the book talking about, the kind of the Susie Orman way, who Susie wouldn't say is financial independence. I don't care what name you put on it, but it's the same concepts of just do the right thing, set it and forget it. You'll be fine. And that is something that I see often in the child-free community.
And because there is more freedom there, you don't necessarily have to hit that big net worth number to start living the financial independence lifestyle. which gets into your acronym, FILE, Financial Independence, Live Early, is this idea that maybe some of these child-free couples are living more of the financial independence lifestyle before they get to the specific net worth number that we normally would use to define financial independence.
Yeah, and the analogy I make is FIRE is kind of like an on-off switch for work. I'm not working or I am. FILE is more of a dimmer switch. Let me find the right thing and invest in me and invest in my life and go back to school and become a librarian or whatever it is, and be happy with life. And I think what I'm finding is because child-free folks don't really want to retire, and as a whole, they don't want to pass on money to the next generation. So this is more that die with zero approach. Their numbers completely change. So the 4% safe withdrawal rate you see a lot in FIRE doesn't work for child-free folks because that assumes you want to keep the principal. So I don't have a number, but I don't know, maybe they can retire 2% instead of 4%, whatever those things are. It completely changed it. And by the way, all the financial software gets screwed up because all the financial software assumes you want to keep your principal, you want to pass it on to another generation, you want to retire. Like Monte Carlo simulations, the whole point is to run a simulation, say, here's my chance of running out of money. So a 90% success in Monte Carlo is a 90% failure for child-free folks because they actually do want to give and live their money and they want to invest in themselves and their life rather than, hey, I just want to sit on a beach and retire. And you're even seeing that in the FIRE community. There's a lot of discussions recently of people going, yeah, I fired 4 years ago. And now what do I do with my life? And I'm going, okay, maybe we had the premise wrong. Maybe the premise is how do we invest in ourselves and find a balance? My challenge to the FIRE community, and I love the FIRE community as a whole, my challenge is you take people that are very goal-driven, you point them towards FIRE, they work really hard at the goal, they hit their goal, and then what? If you don't have something to retire to, you're screwed. Like you need to have a purpose. And when people go, well, then I'm going to work on intergenerational wealth. Fine. But for the child-free people, that's not the option. So it changes everything. I'm working on my next book, and it's the Child-Free Guide to Life and Money. And I jokingly say in there, it's a combination of the Simple Path to Wealth and Die with Zero. You combine those two books together, and you get a child-free approach to it. And what happens is a lot of the standard assumptions in the financial independence world get turned on their head. Not right or wrong, just different, while somebody else is providing support. So, an example for my wife and I, she's on her career path. We're both PhDs, so we have to live certain places because, when you're PhDs, jobs aren't exactly everywhere you can find. Finding two PhD jobs at the same level, at the same place are nearly impossible. You talk about the trailing spouse, the other. So we embrace the garden and the rose. Right now, she's the rose. She's following her career path. I fortunately can work remotely from anywhere, so that works well. But my primary goal is to say, hey, what support does she need? Which could be everything from little gardening, take care of the house, take care of everything else, to, hey, you want to bounce ideas off, you need support for a career, whatever it is. And when I work with couples on this, it's interesting. The person that needs to turn as a rose, and we usually try to set a timeline, 5, 7 years, 10 years, whatever, we're going to take turns. But the person who needs to grow, the gardener knows that. They're like, hey, my spouse has for 2 years needed a change. And by the way, it's not always about like better career or like they might need to, I have somebody who's right now, he quit his job and he's doing the AT trail and he's traveling, and that's his like personal growth. That's an opportunity to be the rose. It could be whatever. When I become the rose, we're going to get in a boat and travel the world. It doesn't have to be career, but usually the gardener knows the rose needs to do it. The roses tend to be a little less willing, let's call it that. My wife will talk about it as, there's a lot of pressure by being the rose. And, she'll sometimes say, I don't want to be the rose anymore. I'm like, well, you are. Like, we already made a deal. Like, we're sticking with it. But it's that opportunity to grow. And you're probably right with parents. Your focus is on the growth of your kids, rightfully so. So your own personal growth gets put aside. When I work with child-free couples, I'm going, hey, my co-host for my podcast, Bree, she actually keeps a list of how many times I told people to quit their jobs. I'm like, if you're miserable doing what you're doing, change. They're like, well, but I'm making $100,000. I have to keep doing it. I'm like, so you're willing to be miserable for $100,000? No, let's change. Your spouse will provide support for a while, go back to school or go learn something, take a sabbatical, something. And I think that is something that's unique to the child-free community. Because you're raising two kids and you want to like somebody change their career in the middle, you probably can't because you got to make ends meet and you got to provide support to the kids.
Up until this point, Jay, we've been really talking about internal factors that have led to child-free living. Let's talk about some of the external, specifically COVID. Did it have a large effect, in your opinion, on people's decision to be child-free?
I'm not sure COVID did, but I will tell you that the overturn of Roe did. And that came just after the book came out. And I'm in Mississippi where that case came from. If you look at the amount of people getting vasectomies after post-Roe world, it went through the roof. I mean, huge difference. Interestingly enough, there's a challenge. A lot of the women have trouble finding an OBGYN who's willing to sterilize them because of judgments and all that, and to the point in some states where they're required to have their husband sign off, which is a separate discussion, like we have politics issues. But what we're seeing is in a post-Roe world, people are going, hey, I want my own, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights. I'm making this choice now. And in the child-free community, they joke about it, but it's true. I haven't dated in forever, so I don't have a clue dating, but they have these apps now. They want to have in the date, do you have a vasectomy or not as a choice? And like self-select because people are taking, they don't want to take any risks and they're taking control. And I've seen a huge shift in the discussion in a post-Roe world, enough so that I actually had to shift around my company because our governor in Mississippi publicly said, hey, we're not reading your mail or tapping your phone's butt. I'm like, but what? What you come to find out is your financial records, they're regulated, so they can pull whatever it is. And even medical records, we're now finding that they can sometimes pull. I had to move my firm from being under the state regulation to being under SEC to protect the privacy of my clients because it's such a big issue. But we're seeing people now go, okay, if I'm not going to have reproductive choice, I'm going to take it in my own hands. And they're making a choice to be child-free and done with it much earlier, which it'll probably take us 5 or 10 years to see the stats. But there's a recent study out of Michigan, looked at adults over 18, and they found just over 20% were child-free by choice. And another about 5% were childless, not by choice. So if Michigan is, representative of the U.S., which is probably pretty close, 25% of the U.S. are child-free or permanently childless. That is huge. In that same study, they found just shy of 8% were LGBTQ plus. So we're talking about a community that's 3 times the size, but people don't know it. And the other part of it is it's a community people love to judge. August 1st is International Child Free Day. People don't know it exists. It's been there for 50 years. We sponsored a billboard in Times Square celebrating child free. And it was interesting. Child free community loved it. And then people from the outside, like I had somebody post, well, this is a global psyop to get people to not have kids. And you're trying to, and I'm like, dude, we're just trying to live our life.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I never put it in these terms, but the post-Roe changes could make being child-free disadvantageous, put you under the microscope, put you under further investigation, just because this idea of maybe you're child-free because you are somehow searching for abortions, searching to do something illegal. I never thought about the persecution, but this would be a community that could be quite affected by some of these laws, especially in southern states.
So we recently sold our house and we're renting, and that's kind of one of those fun ones for child-free folks. Buying a house and owning it is a choice, not a requirement. But when I went to sell my house, I had to take down all my signs and stuff that said child-free wealth because worried about judgment. The realtor kind of like, this has got to go. You don't think about those things, but that's in everyday life. Childless folks will never be married. 32.1% versus 2.5% of parents. Huge difference in just like family structures. And then you feel, well, you don't have a family because you don't have kids. No, we have families. We just have different families. And by the way, buying a house is a choice. And so is having the picket fence and the dog and everything else.
Yeah, it really makes you question. And I saw this in some of the vignettes too, like what we define as marriage, because for a lot of these child-free couples, they don't necessarily need the same exact protections and they don't necessarily get benefits by actually having the piece of paper signed. On the other hand, these are people who very much see themselves as life partners.
Yeah. ignore the emotional and the love and those reasons to get married. The number one reason I see why people get married is actually healthcare benefits. If they could get healthcare benefits without getting married, they'd probably be okay. Where I also get people that been couples forever, whatever. I get groups of friends, romantic, whatever it is. And that's okay because it's their family, their lifestyle. I will tell you, though, the system breaks down. So if you want to see something interesting, so you're a medical doctor, think about it this way. What happens if somebody comes into the hospital, into your practice, and doesn't have a next of kin to make decisions for them? The system just breaks down. Governmental healthcare. And it's one of those I've been working on for about 2 years, and we're finally making some progress, because the problem is who's going to be your financial medical power of attorney, who's going to make the decisions for you, and the legalese that goes around it and all the fun stuff. But we're talking about millions and millions of people that need somebody to fill this role that doesn't exist. The silly example of this is somebody is in a car crash, they go to the hospital, and they can't answer for themselves. Well, next of kin is not there. They're going to go to the government or to the medical policies or whatever they have. But the big question is, well, then who lets their dog out? Who does the basic things that all are taken for granted when you are married with kids? And those are the systematic things that are so far behind.
Yeah, I mean, we see this all the time with people who come in with a long time quote unquote spouse, but they never actually got married, et cetera. And then medical decisions need to be made and they're punted to a distant family member because based on our rules, without having the paperwork in place, the distant family member is closer than the person who's lived with them for the last 20 years and has built a life with them. And that becomes obviously very complicated. I want to bring this back to you and your personal experience writing this book. I was going to ask you about personal regret, but after our conversation, I feel like the answer is you probably don't regret your choice, especially knowing your wife's medical history. But tell me a little bit about what you learned about yourself by doing these interviews and writing this book.
I actually started this. I was doing financial coaching, executive coaching, other things, and then became a certified financial planner. And one of the interesting things to me was in the certified financial planner literature, the educational, it's never once mentioned that people are child-free. It doesn't exist. And the reason I started on the research was I asked the question, so my wife and I were both PhDs, we're child-free. The question I wanted to ask from a research standpoint was, how weird are we? Are there other people out there like us? And by the way, we're weird by our own, just kind of nature. We're one of the few couples that will be sitting down at dinner and talking about research studies, but I didn't realize there's this huge community. And I actually found there's a Reddit community. It's like 1.5 million people in the child-free community. And I started posting ads. I said, hey, share what your life is like. I want to interview people. I want to do this. Those ads got flagged as hate speech for just asking what your life is like being child-free. And I didn't even know the term child-free existed at that time. I was like, we're just living our lives. So it just is. And now I'm deep in the child-free community and deep in understanding where people are at and working it through. And what I realized, and part of the reason why I wrote the book was there's not a great example out there of what does a child-free life look like? What does that work through? And the term, even the term child-free, I fight with the style guides because they put a dash in it, and we don't put a dash in it because that implies you're missing something. Or lacking. And Chelsea Handler recently talked about being child-free or childless. And then the Fox News came after her. And, there's all this stuff you don't realize until you're deep in the community. There's millions and millions of people facing the same issues. And I think that was my big awareness is I'm not alone. And I think you see that in the book. There's somebody in there explaining she'd always gone to church, very religious, and just assumed you have to be a good mother, good father. That was what she was preached at. Didn't even realize there was a choice not to have kids. Those type of awareness, we need to be able to just say, it's okay to be you. And I think that's been my big growth of saying, yep, it's okay to be different. There's people out there like me. I'm actually very normal within the child-free community. I'm just very abnormal in the bigger community.
Is the backlash from society as a whole the biggest issue that the child-free community faces?
I think it is. I did an article for Men's Health, I think it was, and they were talking about it, the dink life. And the biggest issue is everybody has an opinion. I worked in healthcare before, and I had a staff member stop me in the hall and say, I've been thinking about you and your wife and you're both really smart and you need to have kids.
Yeah.
And I'm like, who in the world do you think you are? Like, this is somebody who works for me. Somebody said to me once, I told the story, I said, well, did you tell HR? I'm like, we worked in HR. Okay. But that's just normal. The judgment, it's one of the few communities that's still okay to judge. And everybody seems to have an opinion. And, I think we actually have what we call the Childfree bingo card. We have a bingo card with all the questions we get asked all the time over and over because they're so common. But I think if we can just as a community go out there and go say, yep, we're child free. It's okay. We're fine. Leave us alone. And if other people would accept that, it'd be great. Right now in a post-Roe world, it's been heightened to a point where it's gotten ridiculous. Somebody else tried starting a child-free financial planning firm actually in Tennessee, and he had kids, and like his community and church started saying, well, you hate kids and making these judgments and he had to shut down serving child-free folks because it didn't help. And I'm like, yeah, you got to be willing to take the beatings. I get people all the time on our social media making judgments, and I'm like, why? Like, what did I do to bother you?
Well, Jay, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. I very purposefully started this interview with a negative review of your book to really bring up this idea of the backlash, what we've just been talking about. But when I look at my own life and the people around me, a lot of the younger generation is really talking about this as being not only a viable option, but probably the right option for them. As you mentioned, the numbers are actually staggering. We're talking about maybe 25 to 35% of the population who is looking at this as a lifestyle that's appealing to them. And why shouldn't it be? And I think that's the question I really wanted to ask with this episode today. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you what is up next in your life and where we can find you. First and foremost, what is the best way for us to get a copy of Portraits of Childfree Wealth?
Yeah, you can download a copy of the ebook at childfreewealth.com/book.
Awesome. And tell me what's going on with the Childfree Wealth Podcast.
Yeah, so we are, it's interesting. I've been very happy with the response. We're diving into the child-free topics because we're trying to serve, you do the math, 20% of the U.S., 25% of the U.S., and there's 300 million people there. There's a lot of child-free people. And really what we're trying to say is, by the way, it's okay that your finances are different, and here's how to do that. And I appreciate people like you bringing us on and going, I didn't realize how different it was. And that's the discussion we're trying to start. It's really this discussion around, hey, there's a different recipe and it's okay.
And if people want to reach out to you, ask you questions, hopefully thoughtful, logical questions and not hate mail, what is the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, childfreewealth.com and on all socials except for Twitter at Childfree Wealth. And I say except Twitter because Elon Musk decided childless folks have no stake in the future, shouldn't have a vote. That's the type of stuff we're dealing with.
Well, Jay Zigmont, thank you so much for being on Earn and Invest today.
Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap. All right. I know. I'm going to do the broken record thing here. I've talked about these things before, but I think it's really important when we're talking about child-free wealth. This idea that if you don't have children, it is easier to accumulate wealth, or you can do more of what you want to do. In fact, I've often heard people in the personal finance world or the FIRE world, financial independence, retire early, almost sneer when they talk about young married couples, especially who don't have children. And they kind of say, well, that's the easy button, right? Of course, they're going to become financially independent and retire early. They don't have kids. What do they have to worry about? It's almost a negative connotation that I get from people when we discuss this issue. And I find it interesting because I think we're making the same mistake that I think we often make with money, and a point that I make often in taking stock. When you make that comment towards child-free wealth, when you say, well, of course they have it easy, they don't have kids, what you're really doing is you're putting the cart before the horse. And I think we do this with personal finance way too often. We put our net worth and our money goals before our purpose, identity, and connections. Again, this sounds a little bit like taking stock, but the whole point of that book was to say that purpose, identity, and connection should come first, and then building wealth around those things should come second. So how does that relate to child-free wealth? Well, the point is people who decide not to have children and thus are getting to financial independence faster or even slowing down and doing the things they want to do before they get to financial independence are doing just that. They're putting purpose, identity, and connections before their net worth. They're making this decision about children because for them, having children doesn't benefit their sense of purpose, identity, and connections. You may morally or ethically agree or not agree with that. That doesn't really matter. The point is, by deciding to be child-free, you're putting purpose first. In this case, it's freedom. Most people who decide to not have kids want the freedom to be able to travel, to be able to do their hobbies, to relax, to pretty much do whatever they want. They are putting purpose before net worth while considering what is purposeful for them and how they want to live their life. The same is true for people who decide to have children. If you decide to have children, then in a sense, you're also putting purpose, identity, and connections first because having children fulfills somewhat your sense of purpose, identity, and connections. So again, you are putting what's important to you in front of the economics. Of course, having children is going to cost money and is going to slow you down towards FIRE. But guess what? If you're childless and decide to travel a lot or pursue a hobby, that's also going to slow you down and probably cost you money and keep you from getting to financial independence faster. There is really no difference. So I don't think we really need to talk about child-free wealth. I don't think we have to really consider how that interacts with personal finance if we keep in mind the general theory that we should look first at purpose, identity, and connections, and then use that structure that we've built around living a good life and build our finances around that. I think when we do this, you stop looking at not having kids as a cheat code. It just means that for you, purpose looks like putting your money and energy into different things. Whereas if you want to have kids, then that fulfills you. But in both cases, what's really important is that money comes second. You don't decide to not have kids because it's better financially. You decide not to have kids because it doesn't fulfill you. And if you want to have kids, ultimately most people decide to have them whether they can manage it financially or not, because it's important to them, because they put their purpose, identity, and connections first. I think when we look at this decision with this lens, we realize that we're a lot more alike than we pretend. Whether you have children or not, build your finances around what you want to do with your life, who you want to be, and what feels purposeful. Kids, no kids, it's a personal choice.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Follow Childfree Wealth on social media or email us at podcast@childfreewealth.com. If you're interested in working together, learn more by visiting our website, www.childfreewealth.com. We'll see you next time.